The wind was a sculptor, carving the world into new and terrifying shapes, each gust a chisel against Ilara's exposed skin. It screamed through the skeletal branches of the ancient pines, a lament for a land seized by winter's cruelest mood. Snow, thick and relentless, swirled in a blinding dance, erasing the trail behind her as quickly as Zephyr, her grueler stallion, could break it. Each step for the horse was a plunge into the unknown depths of white, his breath misting in ragged plumes, his powerful body trembling not just from cold, but from the sheer exertion. Ilara leaned low over his neck, her own breath catching in her chest, a fragile warmth against the ice-encrusted wool of her scarf. How long had it been since they'd seen a landmark not draped in this suffocating shroud? Days, it felt like. Days of dwindling supplies, of hope shrinking like a dying ember. What terrible miscalculation, what cruel twist of fate had led her so far astray, into the teeth of a blizzard that the old trappers would have called a white death? Her gloved hands, clumsy with cold, clutched the reins, the leather stiff as iron. The vast, indifferent wilderness pressed in, a silent, frozen predator. This was no place for a lone woman, a cowboy whose domain was usually the sprawling, sun-baked plains, not this alpine nightmare. But desperation had driven her higher, further, chasing a rumor of unbranded strays, a chance to rebuild what she had lost. Now, all that remained was the primal urge to survive, to find shelter before the encroaching night and the deepening freeze stole the last of her strength. Her thoughts, usually sharp and clear, felt sluggish, chilled like the marrow in her bones. She thought of the small, prosperous ranch she'd once called home, the laughter, the warmth, now just ghosts in the blizzard of her memory. That life was gone, swept away by fever and misfortune, leaving her with only Zephyr, a saddle, and a resilience forged in the harsh crucible of the frontier. But even resilience had its limits. She scanned the landscape, a monotonous panorama of white and grey, searching for any sign, any break in the snow, a rock formation, a strangely bent tree, anything that might offer a sliver of hope or direction. Nothing. Just the howl of the wind and the endless, falling snow. Zephyr stumbled, his powerful legs sinking deeper than usual, and he let out a low, protesting whinny. "Easy, boy," Ilara murmured, her voice raspy, patting his snow-dusted neck. "Easy. We'll find something." "We have to," but her words felt hollow, swallowed by the storm's immensity. Was this how it ended? Not in a blaze of glory, not even in a fight, but slowly, quietly freezing in an unmarked grave of snow. A bitter taste filled her mouth, not just from the cold, but from the acrid tang of despair. She had faced down rustlers, survived stampedes, navigated droughts, but this elemental fury, this raw, untamed power of nature, felt different, more absolute. It was Zephyr who alerted her first. His ears, normally relaxed or pricked forward with curiosity, suddenly swiveled, then flattened against his skull. He snorted, a plume of hot air dissipating instantly, and sidestepped nervously, his body tense. Ilara's own senses, dulled by fatigue and cold, sharpened. Through a momentary lull in the swirling snow, she saw it, a dark, irregular shape huddled at the base of a thicket of snow-laden firs, something that didn't belong to the natural landscape. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the storm's roar. Danger? An animal? Or something else? Cautiously, she urged Zephyr forward, one hand instinctively moving towards the worn stock of the rifle scabbarded beside her saddle. As they drew closer, the shape resolved itself. A man. Or what was left of one. He was sprawled awkwardly, half buried in a fresh drift, a dark stain blooming on the snow beneath his leg. His clothing was ragged, inadequate for this weather, and his face, visible where the snow hadn't claimed it, was a waxy, bluish-grey. He looked like another victim of the storm, another soul claimed by the unforgiving mountains. Ilara felt a familiar pang of sorrow, the weary resignation of one who had seen too much death. But then, a flicker. A bare twitch of his fingers, almost imperceptible. He was alive. She dismounted, her legs stiff and aching, sinking to her knees in the deep snow beside him. "Mister," she called out, her voice louder than she intended, raw against the wind. "Mister, can you hear me?" His eyes, caked with ice, fluttered open, revealing pupils dilated and unfocused. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of pure agony. His breath was shallow, rattling. She brushed the snow from his face, noting the lines of hardship etched deep around his eyes and mouth. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, his beard shot with grey. His gaze drifted, then seemed to snag on her, a flicker of desperate recognition, or perhaps just a reflex of the dying. "The cabin," he rasped, his voice a mere whisper, cracked and broken. "Must reach cabin." His gloved hand, gnarled and trembling, made a weak gesture towards the northeast, deeper into the oppressive forest. They need." His voice trailed off, his eyes clouding over again. Ilara's mind raced. A cabin. Shelter. But who were they? And what had happened to him? His leg was clearly broken, the angle unnatural, the blood a stark, terrifying contrast to the pristine white. But there was something else too, a desperate urgency in his broken words that went beyond his own survival. A fierce, paternal fire that even his dying body couldn't extinguish. Her own predicament was dire. Taking on an injured man, perhaps a dying one, in this storm? It was madness. It could be a death sentence for them both. Yet, to leave him here. She looked at his face, the raw plea in his fading eyes. Her own losses, her own struggles, resonated with that silent desperation. The moral compass, the one her father had instilled in her, the one that had guided her through so many hard choices, spun wildly, then settled. She couldn't leave him. Not like this. "All right, mister," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "All right. We'll try for your cabin. You just tell me where." The effort of getting him onto Zephyr, even with the horse's patient cooperation, was a monumental task that left her gasping, her muscles screaming in protest. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of pain and fading consciousness. She fashioned a crude support for his injured leg, biting back her own discomfort as his groans intensified. As she secured him, his head lolled against her shoulder, his breath hot and fetid against her cheek. "Hurry," he mumbled, his words slurred, almost lost in the wind. "The little one, so cold?" Little one? A child? The thought sent a fresh chill, colder than the wind, down Ilara's spine. The stakes had just risen, impossibly, terrifyingly higher. The storm raged on, indifferent, as Ilara, with a dying man in her charge and the spectral image of a little one haunting her mind, urged Zephyr forward into the deepening gloom, towards an unknown cabin and a fate she could not yet comprehend. The journey became a descent into a frozen hell, each step a battle waged against the combined forces of the blizzard, exhaustion, and encroaching despair. Thomas, as she'd heard him mumble his name in a moment of tortured lucidity, was a near insensible weight, his lifeblood staining the saddle and her own worn chaps. His directions, when he could offer them, were fragmented, whispered through chattering teeth and punctuated by groans of pain that tore at Ilara's already frayed nerves. Follow the ridge, then the scarred pine, turn left at the frozen creek. But in this whiteout, ridges blurred into undifferentiated slopes, every pine seemed scarred by wind and ice, and creeks were buried deep beneath feet of snow, their paths only guessed at. Ilara relied on her instincts, honed by years of reading the subtle language of the land, but even those were failing her in this alien, hostile environment. Zephyr, bless his strong heart, plodded onward, his ears constantly twitching, testing the wind, his massive hooves seeking purchase on the treacherous, hidden ground. He seemed to sense the urgency, the desperation that radiated from his rider and the dying man strapped precariously behind her. Several times, he stopped, refusing to move, forcing Ilara to dismount and scout ahead, probing the snow with a broken branch, narrowly avoiding hidden crevasses or dangerously steep drop-offs concealed by the deceptive smoothness of the snow. The cold was a physical entity, a malevolent presence that clawed at any exposed skin, seeped through layers of wool and leather, and settled deep into her bones. Her fingers and toes were numb, aching reminders of the frostbite that threatened. She pulled her scarf tighter, the ice crystals clinging to it scratching her chapped lips. Thomas's mutterings became more incoherent, a litany of fear and sorrow. Darkness, coming for them. He'd rasp, his voice thin as a winter reed. Keep them safe, promised her. Who was her? His wife? And who were they? That the little one he'd mentioned before? The questions gnawed at Ilara, adding a layer of psychological torment to her physical ordeal. She pictured a small, vulnerable face, lost and afraid, waiting in some isolated hovel, and her determination hardened, even as her body screamed for rest. She found herself talking to Thomas, not expecting answers, but to fill the terrifying silence, to keep the thread of his consciousness, however tenuous, from snapping completely. "We're getting closer, Thomas. Just hold on. Tell me about this cabin. Is it warm? Is there wood?" Sometimes, he would respond with a single, garbled word, firewood, low. Or shelter, good roof. Other times, only a pained sigh answered her. The wind shrieked, tearing at them, trying to rip Thomas from the saddle, to scour Ilara from Zephyr's back. Snow caked her eyelashes, blurring her vision. She blinked it away, forcing her eyes to scan, to search, to hope. The light began to fail, the short winter day surrendering to an early, ominous twilight. The grey sky deepened to a bruised purple, and the shadows of the trees stretched into grotesque, menacing figures. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at Ilara. To be caught out in the open, in the dark, in this storm, with an injured man, it was unthinkable. She pushed Zephyr harder, whispering words of encouragement, promises of rest and grain she wasn't sure she could keep. Her own hunger gnawed at her, a dull ache in her stomach, but she ignored it. Survival was paramount, not for herself anymore, but for the man whose life was literally in her hands, and for the mysterious they who haunted his dying words. Then, through a momentary thinning of the snow, Thomas stirred, his head lifting slightly. "There," he croaked, his voice barely audible above the wind. He pointed a trembling, snow-caked finger towards a dense stand of ancient firs, their lower branches weighed down heavily with snow, forming an almost solid wall. Behind, the elders. Ilara strained her eyes. At first, she saw nothing but more trees, more snow. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, threatened to overwhelm her. Was he delirious again? But Zephyr, too, seemed to sense something. His ears perked, and he snorted, a low rumble in his chest. He shifted his weight, eager to move in the direction Thomas had indicated. Trusting her horse's instincts as much as the dying man's fleeting coherence, Ilara nudged Zephyr forward. They pushed through the heavy, snow-laden branches, which scraped against them, dumping their cold burdens down Ilara's neck and back. And then, they were through. Before them, nestled in a small, sheltered hollow, almost swallowed by drifts, stood a cabin. It was small, crudely built from rough-hewn logs, with a low, sloping roof piled high with snow. No smoke curled from its stone chimney, no light glowed from its single, small window, which was dark and opaque as a blind eye. It looked utterly deserted, as desolate and forgotten as the landscape around it. A wave of apprehension washed over Ilara. Was this it? This bleak, silent hovel? Was this the sanctuary Thomas had risked his life to reach? It felt more like a tomb. Thomas let out a shuddering sigh, a sound that could have been relief or resignation. "We made it," he whispered, and then his body went limp, his head falling heavily against her back. His breathing, already shallow, became almost imperceptible. The silence that descended then was profound, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through the surrounding trees and the heavy panting of Zephyr. The cabin stood before them, a dark enigma against the deepening twilight, holding its secrets close. Ilara's heart pounded with a mixture of dread and a desperate, flickering hope. What or who awaited them inside that frozen, silent structure? Ilara slid from Zephyr's back, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. The snow in the hollow was thigh-deep, making each movement a struggle. Her first priority was Thomas. Gently, she worked to unstrap him, his inert form a terrifying weight. She managed to lower him into the snow, propping him against Zephyr's sturdy side for a moment of shelter from the wind. His face was ashen, his lips tinged with blue. His pulse, when she pressed her numb fingers to his neck, was thready, almost non-existent. "Thomas," she whispered, shaking him gently. "Thomas, we're here." "We're at the cabin." There was no response. His eyes remained closed, his breath a shallow, almost imperceptible flutter. He was fading, slipping away into the cold darkness that had pursued them relentlessly. A profound sense of helplessness washed over Ilara. She had brought him this far, but she was no doctor, no miracle worker. All she could do now was try to get him inside, out of the killing wind. Zephyr, patient and stoic, stood firm, his warm body a temporary shield. Ilara gave his neck a grateful pat. "Good boy," she murmured, her voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. Just a little longer she turned her attention to the cabin. It looked even more forlorn up close. The logs were chinked with mud and moss, much of it cracked or fallen away, offering little resistance to the pervasive cold. The single window was covered with what looked like stretched animal hide, opaque and forbidding. The door, a rough plank construction, was drifted high with snow. There was no path, no sign of recent passage. A heavy silence emanated from within, a silence that felt old and settled, as if the cabin had been empty for an eternity. Where were they? Where was the little one Thomas had spoken of with such desperate urgency? A knot of dread tightened in Ilara's stomach. Had they been too late? Had the storm, or whatever danger Thomas was fleeing, already claimed them? She pushed the grim thoughts aside. Speculation was a luxury she couldn't afford. She needed to act. First, shelter for Thomas, then she would face whatever lay within those silent walls. Leaving him exposed for even a few more minutes could be fatal. With gritted teeth and a prayer she wasn't sure anyone was listening to, she began to clear the snow from the cabin door, using her gloved hands and a piece of broken branch she found nearby. The snow was heavy, compacted by the wind, and the work was back-breaking. Every muscle screamed in protest, her lungs burned with the effort of drawing in the frigid air. Finally, she reached the rough-hewn planks of the door. A simple wooden latch, swollen and frozen, held it shut. She fumbled with it, her fingers clumsy and unresponsive. Frustration welled up, hot and sharp, a stark contrast to the numbing cold that enveloped her. With a cry of exertion, she put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It creaked, groaned, then grudgingly gave way, opening inward with a sigh of displaced, frigid air. A wave of musty, chillingly still air washed over her, carrying no scent of wood smoke, no hint of life. Only the faint, unsettling aroma of damp earth, old ashes, and something else, something she couldn't quite place, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. She peered into the gloom. The interior was a pool of shadows, the dying twilight barely penetrating the small, hide-covered window. She couldn't make out any details, only vague shapes and an overwhelming sense of emptiness. "Hello," she called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. "Is anyone here?" Only the echo of her own voice answered, swallowed by the oppressive silence. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, traced its way down her spine. This wasn't right. Thomas had been so desperate, so certain. There had to be someone, something here. Leaving the door ajar, she hurried back to Thomas. With strength born of sheer desperation, she half-dragged, half-carried him across the threshold and into the relative shelter of the cabin. He was a dead weight, his head lolling, his breathing now so faint she could barely detect it. She laid him gently on the packed earth floor, near where a stone hearth stood cold and empty. His eyes fluttered open for a brief, agonizing moment. His lips moved, forming a single, almost inaudible word. "Lily." Then, with a soft, shuddering sigh, his body relaxed completely. The shallow rise and fall of his chest ceased. Ilara stared at him, her own breath catching in her throat. She pressed her fingers to his neck again. Nothing. The faint, thready pulse was gone. Thomas was dead. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He had made it to his cabin, but not to salvation. And he had died with a name on his lips, a name that now echoed in the chilling emptiness of the cabin. Lily. The little one. The darkness inside the cabin was almost absolute now, broken only by the faint, ghostly light filtering through the still open doorway, where the snow continued to swirl in a mesmerizing, relentless ballet. Ilara stood frozen for a moment, the finality of Thomas's death settling upon her like a shroud. She had failed him, in the end. Or perhaps, she thought with a pang of guilt, he had used the last of his life force to guide her here, for a purpose she had yet to understand. The name, Lily, resonated in the frigid air, a fragile whisper against the vast, indifferent silence of the wilderness. Her own grief and exhaustion were immense, a crushing weight, but Thomas's last word, his dying plea, spurred her beyond them. There was still a mystery to unravel, a responsibility he had, in his final moments, seemingly passed to her. She carefully closed the rough plank door, plunging the cabin into near total blackness. The wind's howl muted slightly, but the cold remained, a palpable presence. Her hands fumbled in her saddlebags, which she'd managed to bring inside before tending to Thomas. Her fingers, stiff and aching, searched for her tinderbox and a precious, carefully hoarded stub of a candle. After several frustrating attempts, a tiny spark caught, flared, and a small, wavering flame sprang to life, pushing back the oppressive darkness. She lit the candle, its meager glow casting long, dancing shadows on the rough log walls. The light revealed a scene of stark poverty and desperate survival. The cabin was a single, small room. A crude table and 2 rickety stools stood in one corner. Empty shelves lined one wall. The hearth was indeed cold, a pile of grey ashes the only evidence of past fires. A few ragged blankets were piled in another corner, forming a makeshift bed. But it was the silence, the utter lack of any sound of life other than her own breathing, that was most unnerving. Where was Lily? Then, she heard it. A sound so faint, so fragile, it was almost lost beneath the sigh of the wind against the cabin walls. A whimper. A tiny, almost inaudible whimper, like that of a distressed kitten. Ilara's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound came from the pile of blankets in the far corner. Holding the candle aloft, its flickering light casting grotesque, elongated shadows that writhed and danced, she moved slowly, cautiously, towards the source of the sound. Her boots made soft scuffing noises on the earthen floor, each step amplifying the beat of her own heart. As she drew closer, the whimpering became more distinct, interspersed with tiny, hitching breaths. She reached the corner and knelt, her breath held tight in her chest. With a trembling hand, she pulled back the topmost blanket, a coarse, threadbare thing that smelled faintly of wood smoke and something else, something akin to fear. And there, nestled in the meager warmth of the tattered bedding, was the source of the sound. A child. A little girl, no more than 3 or 4 years old, her face pale and tear-streaked in the candlelight. Her eyes were closed, her tiny body curled into a tight ball, shivering uncontrollably. Her hair, a tangle of light brown curls, was matted against her small, delicate forehead. She was so small, so utterly vulnerable, a tiny spark of life in this vast, frozen emptiness. Ilara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was Lily. This was the little one Thomas had fought so desperately to reach, the reason for his impossible journey, his dying plea. The shock of it, the raw, brutal reality of finding a child alone, abandoned, in such a dire state, hit Ilara with a force that stole her breath. Disbelief warred with a sudden, fierce surge of protectiveness, an emotion so potent it momentarily eclipsed her exhaustion, her grief, her fear. The child whimpered again, a small, lost sound that tore at Ilara's heart. She was alive, but barely. Her skin, where Ilara gently touched her cheek, was icy cold. Her lips were tinged with blue. The cabin itself was a tomb of ice, and this child was slowly freezing within it. The sight galvanized Ilara. There was no time for questions, no time for despair. Only action. With a newfound urgency, Ilara set the candle on the crude table, its flame casting a small circle of light in the oppressive gloom. Her first priority was fire. Without warmth, the child would not survive the night. She scanned the cabin desperately. Where was the firewood Thomas had spoken of? Her eyes fell on a small, dwindling pile of split logs and kindling tucked beside the hearth, barely enough for a few hours, certainly not enough to fight back the bitter cold that had infiltrated every inch of the cabin. It was a terrifyingly small amount. But it was a start. Working with a speed and efficiency born of desperation, Ilara cleared the old ashes from the hearth. Her hands, though still numb, moved with purpose. She laid the kindling, coaxed a flame from her tinderbox, and carefully added small pieces of wood, nursing the fragile blaze, praying it would catch. The wood was dry, thankfully, and soon, a small, hesitant fire began to crackle, its tiny flames a beacon of hope in the frigid darkness. It was a pitifully small fire, but it was life. As the first tendrils of warmth began to push back the worst of the chill, Elara turned her attention back to Lily. She gently gathered the child into her arms. Lily was light, terrifyingly so, her small body limp and unresponsive. Elara carried her closer to the burgeoning fire, cradling her carefully. She chafed the child's small, icy hands and feet, whispering soft, soothing words of comfort and reassurance she wasn't sure Lily could even hear. "It's all right, little one. You're safe now. I'm here. We'll get you warm." Lily stirred faintly, a tiny sigh escaping her lips, but her eyes remained closed. Elara rocked her gently, her own body acting as a shield against the lingering cold, her gaze fixed on the child's pale, still face. Who could do this? Who could leave a child, so young, so vulnerable, alone in this desolate place, with winter raging outside and supplies dwindling to nothing? The anger that had briefly surfaced earlier returned, a cold, hard knot in her chest. But it was quickly overshadowed by a fierce, primal protectiveness. This child, this Lily, was her responsibility now. Thomas had led her here, and in his death, he had entrusted this precious, fragile life into her care. It was a trust Elara knew, with absolute certainty, she would not betray. The cabin was still dangerously cold, the fire a small, struggling thing against the immensity of the winter night, but for the first time since stumbling upon Thomas in the snow, a flicker of something other than fear and desperation ignited within Elara, a sense of purpose, fierce and undeniable. She would save this child. She had to. The immediate crisis of freezing to death was narrowly averted, but the precariousness of their situation hung heavy in the small, firelit cabin. Elara knew the small pile of wood wouldn't last long. As Lily lay wrapped in Elara's own driest bedroll close to the hearth, her breathing slowly becoming a little less shallow, Elara began a more thorough, desperate search of the cabin. Every shadow, every corner, was investigated by the flickering candlelight and the growing, though still modest, glow from the fireplace. She needed food, more fuel, and answers. The shelves were mostly bare, yielding only a half-empty sack of stone ground flour, a handful of dried beans, and a small, nearly empty tin of lard. Not nearly enough to sustain them for long, especially a growing child. There was no sign of Thomas's gear, no rifle, no hunter's pack, suggesting he had left in a hurry or been caught unawares. Perhaps he had been out hunting or foraging when whatever calamity befell him occurred. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through her. What had he been running from? What danger had led him to this desperate, isolated refuge, and ultimately, to his death? The cabin itself offered few clues. It was built for survival, not comfort. The furniture was handmade and rough. The earthen floor was cold and damp. Yet, amidst the starkness, there were small, poignant signs of a life lived here, however harsh. A crudely carved wooden bird, small enough to fit in a child's palm, lay on the floor near the makeshift bed, as if recently dropped. A piece of charcoal, perhaps used for drawing, rested on the edge of the table. These small details painted a picture of a life that, while undoubtedly difficult, had also held moments of tenderness, of a parent's love for a child. Her search for more firewood inside the cabin proved fruitless. She would have to brave the storm again, to scavenge outside. But not yet. Not while Lily was still so fragile. The child's survival was paramount. Elara found a small, dented pot and, using melted snow and a precious handful of flour, began to prepare a thin gruel. It wasn't much, but it would be warm and, hopefully, provide some nourishment. As she stirred the mixture over the small fire, her gaze kept drifting to Thomas's still form, lying near the door where she had left him, covered now with one of the cabin's threadbare blankets. A wave of sorrow washed over her. She hadn't known him, not really, but he had shown incredible courage and determination in his final hours. He had died trying to save his Lily. She owed it to him to learn the truth, to understand what had happened here. Tucked beneath the ragged pile of blankets where she had found Lily, her fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular. Pulling it out, she found a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with handling, its pages brittle and water-stained in places. Her heart quickened. This could be it. The answers she sought. With trembling hands, she opened it near the firelight. The handwriting inside was faint, spidery, and clearly female. It was not Thomas's journal. It belonged to Lily's mother. The first few entries were dated several months back, filled with simple observations of forest life, recipes for foraged herbs, and loving descriptions of a young child's playful antics. There was a quiet joy in those early pages, a sense of peace found in isolation. But as the entries progressed, the tone began to shift. Fear crept in, like a chilling mist. Vague mentions of them appeared, of being watched, of needing to be more careful. They passed close by today, one entry read. Saw the smoke from their campfire. We must be more vigilant. Thomas worries constantly. He says they won't give up. Who were they? The journal didn't explicitly state, but the implication was clear. These were people to be feared, people who posed a significant threat. The entries became shorter, more frantic. Food is running low. The snows came early this year. Thomas risked going to the old trapping lines, but found nothing. Lily coughed through the night. Her fever is high. I pray for her. I pray for a miracle. The mother's desperation, her love and fear for her child, bled from every word, reaching across time to grip Ilara's heart. The last few entries were barely legible, the ink smudged as if by tears or trembling hands. He's overdue. Thomas went for help, or supplies, days ago. The storm. I can't keep the fire going much longer. Lily is so weak. If anyone finds this, please, protect my Lily. Her name is Lilian. She is my world. The final entry was just 2 words, scrawled and desperate. They're coming. Ilara closed the journal, her own eye stinging. The story it told was one of love, desperation, and a terrifying, unseen enemy. Lily's mother was likely gone, perhaps taken by these mysterious pursuers, or succumbed to illness or the harsh conditions. Thomas, it seemed, was not Lily's father, but her protector, a brave man who had taken on the sacred duty of keeping her safe after her mother's disappearance or death. He had been trying to get help, just as the journal said, when he was injured and found by Ilara. And that they from the journal, were they the ones who had injured Thomas? Were they still out there, searching for this cabin, for this child? The thought sent a shiver of pure dread down Ilara's spine. She was no longer just battling the elements, she was potentially facing a human threat, ruthless and unknown. The gruel was ready. Gently, Ilara roused Lily, who whimpered softly, her eyes fluttering open. They were large and blue, shadowed with fear and confusion, but in their depths, Ilara saw a spark of resilience. It's all right, sweet girl, Ilara crooned, her voice softer than she knew she possessed. I'm Ilara. I'm here to help. Let's get something warm into your tummy. Slowly, painstakingly, she fed Lily small spoonfuls of the warm gruel. The child swallowed weakly at first, then with a little more strength, her gaze fixed on Ilara's face with a mixture of apprehension and dawning trust. A tiny, almost imperceptible sigh escaped Lily's lips, a sound that might have been contentment. In that moment, watching the small flame of life flicker a little brighter in the child's eyes, Ilara's resolve solidified into an unshakable certainty. She would protect Lilian. Whatever the cost. Whatever dangers lay beyond the fragile shelter of the cabin walls. The next few days unfolded in a tense, exhausting rhythm, dictated by the needs of a recovering child and the ever-present threat of the wilderness and the unknown pursuers. Ilara ventured out only when absolutely necessary, battling the biting wind and deep snow to gather firewood. The forest around the cabin was dense, offering a decent supply of fallen branches and deadwood, but each excursion was fraught with peril. She moved like a ghost, every sense alert, her rifle always close at hand, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement, any track that wasn't her own or an animal's. The journal's ominous final entry, "They're coming," echoed in her mind, a constant, chilling reminder of the danger that might still be lurking. Inside the cabin, a fragile warmth began to permeate the oppressive cold. Ilara kept the fire burning steadily, a small but defiant beacon against the vast, frozen wilderness. She was meticulous in her care for Lily, coaxing her to eat the meager rations of flour gruel, thickened sometimes with a little precious lard for calories, or a few painstakingly rehydrated beans. She talked to the child constantly, her voice a low, soothing murmur, telling her stories of the plains, of horses that ran like the wind, of stars so bright they looked like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Slowly, miraculously, Lily began to respond. The fear in her wide blue eyes started to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She began to watch Ilara with an unnerving intensity, as if trying to understand this strange woman who had appeared out of the storm. One afternoon, as Ilara was mending a tear in Lily's ragged dress with a needle and thread from her own small sewing kit, Lily reached out a tiny hand and touched Ilara's cheek. Her fingers were still cold, but the touch was feather-light, a silent question. Ilara smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Hello there, little bird," she whispered. Lily's first word to her was "Mama." It was a hopeful, questioning whisper, uttered as she woke from a fretful nap, her eyes searching Ilara's face. Ilara's heart clenched. She gently stroked Lily's hair. "No, sweet girl," she said softly. "I'm not your mama. Your mama loved you very, very much." She was very brave. She didn't know how to explain death or disappearance to a child so young, so she focused on the love that was evident in every line of the journal. Lily's lower lip trembled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she snuggled closer to Ilara, seeking comfort in her presence. A profound, almost overwhelming tenderness filled Ilara. She had never considered herself maternal, her life had been too hard, too solitary for such softness. But this small, vulnerable child was burrowing her way into Ilara's heart, filling a void she hadn't even realized was there. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, an unspoken connection forged in shared hardship and growing trust. Lily began to offer fleeting smiles, and once, a sound that might have been a giggle when Ilara made a funny face while trying to coax her to eat. These small moments were precious jewels, glinting amidst the harsh realities of their existence. Ilara taught Lily how to keep her hands warm by the fire, how to listen for the sound of the wind, how to be quiet when Ilara signaled. The child was a quick learner, her innate survival instincts surprisingly strong. Despite these moments of connection, the shadow of the pursuers loomed large. Ilara found herself sleeping lightly, waking at the slightest sound, the creak of the cabin log settling, the scurry of some small animal outside, the howl of a distant wolf. Each noise sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She checked the area around the cabin meticulously each morning, looking for any disturbance in the snow. One morning, her blood ran cold. Not far from the tree line, partially obscured by fresh snowfall, she found them, footprints. Not her own. Not Zephyr's. These were the prints of heavy boots, 2 sets, moving with purpose, too close to the cabin for comfort. They were at least a day old, the edges softened by the wind and new snow, but they were undeniably human. They had been here. Or someone very much like them. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her. Had they seen the cabin? Had they seen smoke from the chimney, however faint? Were they watching, waiting? The journal had said they wouldn't give up. Ilara's protective instincts, already fiercely engaged, went into overdrive. She backed away slowly, carefully obliterating her own tracks as she retreated to the cabin. Her mind raced. Staying here was becoming increasingly dangerous. The meager supplies wouldn't last much longer, and the cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. But the thought of taking Lily out into the treacherous wilderness, with the pursuers potentially closing in, was equally terrifying. The child was stronger now, but still so fragile. That night, the wind howled with a renewed fury, rattling the small window covering, making the flames in the hearth dance wildly. Ilara sat by the fire, Lily asleep in her arms, her rifle resting across her lap. She listened, every nerve-ending roar, to the sounds of the storm, trying to distinguish them from any other, more sinister noises. The cabin felt terribly small, terribly vulnerable. The forest outside seemed to press in, full of unseen eyes and silent threats. She thought of Thomas, of Lily's mother, of their desperate struggle to protect this child. Now, that burden was hers. And she would not fail. The discovery of the tracks shattered any illusion of safety Elara might have clung to. The enemy was no longer a faceless fear whispered in the pages of a journal, they were real, their presence a palpable threat that hung heavy in the frozen air. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside, sent Elara's heart leaping into her throat. She began to sleep even less, her nights spent listening, her rifle always within arm's reach. Lily, perceptive despite her young age, sensed the change in Elara, the heightened tension. She became quieter, her large blue eyes often fixed on Elara's face with a worried expression. Elara did her best to reassure her with gentle touches and soft words, but the fear was a constant, unwelcome companion. She knew they couldn't stay. The cabin was a fixed point, a target. Their supplies were dwindling rapidly, the last of the flour was almost gone, the beans a precious, carefully rationed handful. Zephyr, tethered in a small, makeshift lean-to Elara had constructed against one wall of the cabin to offer him some protection from the worst of the elements, was also running low on the small store of feed she'd carried. The horse was their only means of swift escape, if it came to that. Elara began to make preparations, her mind working with a cold, clear focus. She mended their clothing, reinforcing seams, patching holes. She sharpened her hunting knife. She carefully cleaned and oiled her rifle, checking her meager supply of ammunition. Each action was deliberate, purposeful, a small act of defiance against the encroaching dread. She considered her options. Try to wait out the pursuers, hoping they would give up and move on. Unlikely, given the journal's grim warnings. Stay and fortify the cabin, try to make a stand? Against an unknown number of armed men, with a small child to protect, it was a suicidal notion. The only viable option, as terrifying as it was to leave. To take Lily and flee, deeper into the wilderness or, if possible, towards civilization, however distant that might be. But the timing had to be right. Another heavy snowfall would help cover their tracks, but it would also make travel more arduous, more dangerous for Lily. She needed a window, a break in the weather, however brief. She studied the sky constantly, trying to read the signs, to predict the storm's moods. One afternoon, while Elara was outside gathering a sparse armful of firewood, keeping close to the cabin, her senses on high alert, she saw him. A flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing, a dark shape against the snow-laden trees, too large to be an animal. Her breath hitched. She froze, her hand instinctively going to the axe she carried for cutting wood. The figure was distant, partially obscured by the trees, but there was no mistaking it. A man, tall and heavily built, wearing dark clothing. He was scanning the area, his movement slow, methodical, predatory. He hadn't seen her yet. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. They were here. She backed away slowly, silently, melting back into the deeper shadows closer to the cabin. Her mind raced. Was he alone? Or were there others? She couldn't risk a direct confrontation, not with Lily inside and vulnerable. She had to get back to the cabin, to Lily, to Zephyr. Her retreat felt agonizingly slow, each step measured, careful not to snap a twig or dislodge snow that might betray her presence. Once inside, she quickly and quietly barred the door, her hands trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. Lily looked up at her, her eyes wide with unspoken fear. Elara forced a reassuring smile. "It's all right, little bird," she whispered, though her voice was tight with tension. "We're just going to play a very quiet game." She quickly gathered their few remaining belongings, the journal, the last of the food, her ammunition, Lily's small wooden bird. She strapped the bedroll and supplies onto Zephyr's saddle, which she had kept inside, working with a desperate efficiency. The horse, sensing the urgency in her movements, shifted nervously but stood patient. The man outside, or perhaps his companions, could discover the cabin at any moment. They had to leave. Now. Waiting for a break in the weather was no longer an option. Their only chance was to use the fading light and the cover of the dense forest to slip away unnoticed. "We're going on an adventure, Lily," Elara said, her voice low and steady, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. She bundled the child in every warm layer they possessed, then wrapped her securely in a blanket. "You have to be very brave and very quiet, understand?" Lily nodded solemnly, her small face pale but resolute. She clutched her wooden bird tightly. Elara took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping the small, familiar cabin one last time. It had been a refuge, a prison, a place of sorrow and unexpected joy. Now, it was a place they had to leave behind. She unbarred the door, peering out cautiously. The clearing seemed empty, the distant figure gone. But she knew he, or they, were out there. Somewhere. This was no escape into safety, it was a flight into the unknown, into deeper peril. But with Lily in her arms, Elara felt a surge of fierce determination. She would not let them take this child. She would run, she would fight, she would do whatever it took to keep Lily safe. The forest awaited, cold and unforgiving, but it also offered the hope of concealment, of escape. The decision was made, forced upon them by the chilling sight of the watcher in the woods. There was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. Elara swung Lily up into the saddle in front of her, settling the child securely against her own body for warmth and protection. Zephyr, sensing the gravity of the moment, stood tensed but ready, his breath misting in the frigid air. Elara whispered a soothing word to him, her hand resting briefly on his powerful neck. He was more than just a horse, he was her partner, her ally, their best hope for outrunning the danger that nipped at their heels. She took one last, sweeping look around the small clearing. The cabin stood silent, already looking abandoned, as if it were trying to erase their presence, to sink back into the anonymity of the wilderness. Thomas's body still lay within, a solemn sentinel. There was no time for a proper burial, a regret that weighed heavily on Elara, but she offered a silent prayer for his soul, a promise to honor his sacrifice by protecting Lily. With a gentle nudge of her heels, she urged Zephyr forward, not back along the path they had taken to reach the cabin, but deeper into the dense, untracked forest, choosing a direction that offered the thickest cover. The snow was deep here, slowing their progress, but the towering pines and dense undergrowth provided a welcome shield from prying eyes. Every snap of a twig under Zephyr's hooves, every rustle of a branch, sounded deafeningly loud to Elara's overwrought senses. She strained her ears, listening for any sound of pursuit, her gaze constantly scanning their back trail. Lily was quiet, her small face pressed against Elara's chest, her arms wrapped tightly around Elara's waist. Elara could feel the child's slight trembling and held her closer, trying to project an aura of calm she was far from feeling. The light began to fade rapidly, the deep shadows of the forest floor merging into a premature twilight. This was both a blessing and a curse. The darkness would help conceal them, but it also made travel treacherous. Elara relied on Zephyr's surefootedness and her own ingrained sense of direction, pushing them onward, driven by a desperate urgency. She pictured the man she had seen, his watchful stance, his predatory stillness. Was he alone? The journal had spoken of them, plural. The thought of multiple pursuers, armed and determined, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. What did they want with a small child? Was it something to do with Lily's parents? The journal had been maddeningly vague on the specifics of the threat, hinting only at a relentless, unnamed danger. Hours passed in a blur of cold, exhaustion, and gnawing anxiety. Zephyr, despite the difficult terrain and the double burden, pressed on tirelessly, his loyalty and strength a constant source of comfort to Elara. She spoke to him in low tones, words of encouragement and gratitude. The forest was a labyrinth of snow-laden trees and frozen silence, broken only by the sigh of the wind in the high branches and their own hushed progress. Elara chose their path carefully, avoiding open spaces, sticking to the dense thickets, trying to leave as little sign of their passage as possible. She knew, however, that a skilled tracker would eventually find their trail. Their only hope was to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the cabin before morning. Sometime deep in the night, under a sliver of a moon that offered little illumination through the thick canopy, Elara sensed a change. A subtle shift in the wind, a heightened tension in Zephyr's posture. He stopped abruptly, his ears pricked forward, his nostrils flaring. Ilara's heart lurched. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her hand automatically reaching for the rifle. She listened intently, straining to hear over the pounding of her own blood. And then she heard it, a distant sound, carried on the wind. The faint, unmistakable baying of a hound. Pursuers! And they had a dog. Her blood ran cold. A dog could follow their scent for miles, through any terrain, in any weather. Their chances of evading detection had just plummeted. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she fought it back, her mind racing. They couldn't outrun a dog indefinitely, not in this wilderness. She had to make a stand. Or find a way to break the scent trail. Her eye scanned the dark, forbidding landscape. They were in a narrow ravine, the side steep and rocky. Up ahead, she could just make out the gleam of ice, a frozen stream. An idea, desperate and risky, began to form in her mind. "Hold tight, Lily," she murmured, her voice taut. She urged Zephyr forward, towards the frozen stream. If they could travel along the ice for a distance, it might confuse the hound, buy them some precious time. The ice was slick, treacherous, but Zephyr, with his incredible balance, picked his way carefully. The baying of the hound seemed closer now, a chilling, relentless sound that echoed through the silent forest. Ilara knew they were running out of time. The stream twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the ravine. Then, up ahead, she saw it, a small, dark opening in the rock face, partially hidden by a curtain of frozen icicles. A cave. It wasn't much, but it was defensible. And it was their only chance. The cave was little more than a shallow overhang, barely deep enough to offer shelter for herself, Lily, and Zephyr, but it was set back from the frozen stream, its entrance partially obscured by a jagged outcrop of rock and a thick tangle of frozen brush. It was their only hope. "In here, quickly," Ilara urged Zephyr, dismounting swiftly and pulling Lily down with her. The child was stiff with cold and fear, but silent, her eyes wide and trusting as she looked up at Ilara. That trust was a heavy weight, a profound responsibility. Ilara led Zephyr into the narrow confines of the cave, the horse shifting uneasily in the enclosed space but obeying her command. She positioned him near the entrance, a living shield. Then, taking her rifle, she peered out through a narrow gap in the brush. The baying of the hound was closer now, alarmingly so. Soon, their pursuers would be upon them. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she checked the rifle's chamber. She had only a few rounds of ammunition left, a fact that settled like a stone in her stomach. Each shot would have to count. She couldn't afford a prolonged firefight. Her best chance was to surprise them, to make them think twice about pressing an attack against a defender in a fortified position. Lily huddled behind her, clutching her small wooden bird, her breathing shallow but controlled. Ilara reached back and squeezed the child's shoulder reassuringly, though her own heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Stay down, little one," she whispered. "And stay quiet, no matter what." Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were Zephyr's soft snorts, Lily's quiet breathing, and the relentless, approaching bay of the hound. Then, a new sound, the crunch of boots on frozen snow, the murmur of voices. They were close. Ilara pressed herself tighter against the cold rock, her eyes sighting down the barrel of the rifle. Through the tangled brush, she saw them. Two men, burly and rough-looking, dressed in dark, heavy winter clothing. One man held the leash of a large, lean hound, which was straining forward, its nose to the ground, whining with excitement. The other man carried a rifle, his gaze sweeping the ravine. They were trackers, hard men, their faces grim and determined in the pale moonlight. They stopped at the edge of the frozen stream, near where Ilara had guided Zephyr onto the ice. The dog became agitated, sniffing the air, then barking towards the cave. "In there, looks like," one of the men grunted, his voice coarse. "Smells for sure. Thought they could lose us on the ice, did they?" The other man laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Not with Old Blue here. Nowhere to run now. The boss wants the girl, unharmed if possible." The woman, she's expendable. Ilara's blood ran cold at his words. The boss, so there was someone else behind this, someone who wanted Lily specifically. And they clearly had no qualms about eliminating anyone who stood in their way. A cold rage, fierce and pure, surged through Ilara. These men, this boss, they would not have Lily. Not while she drew breath. She took a steadying breath, her finger tightening on the trigger. She wouldn't fire unless she had to, but she would not let them reach the cave. That's far enough. Ilara's voice rang out, sharp and clear, startling the men. They froze, their heads snapping up, surprise and then anger flitting across their faces as they spotted the glint of her rifle barrel through the brush. "Who's there?" the first man yelled, raising his own rifle. "Show yourself." "This child is under my protection," Ilara called back, her voice unwavering despite the tremor in her limbs. "Turn around and leave. Now. Or you'll regret it," the man with the dog snarled. "Just a woman. Think she can stop us? There's two of us, lady. And we want the girl." He took a step forward. "I'm warning you," Ilara said, her tone deadly serious. "One more step, and I fire." She aimed carefully, not at the man, but at the snow just in front of his feet. The man hesitated, then a sneer spread across his face. "She's bluffing." He took another step. The rifle bucked against Ilara's shoulder. The shot echoed through the ravine, deafeningly loud. Snow and ice exploded inches from the man's boot. He yelped and jumped back, his eyes wide with shock. The hound barked furiously. "Next one won't miss," Ilara stated, her voice like ice. The two men exchanged uncertain glances. They hadn't expected armed resistance, certainly not from a lone woman. The darkness, the confined space, Ilara's unseen position, all worked to her advantage. They didn't know how many people were in the cave, or how well armed they were. Doubt flickered in their eyes. The man who had been shot at muttered something to his companion. After a tense moment, the second man, the one who seemed more cautious, nodded slowly. "All right, lady," he called out, his voice less confident now. "All right. We'll back off. For now. But this ain't over. The boss always gets what he wants." They began to retreat slowly, pulling the reluctant hound with them, their eyes still warily fixed on the dark opening of the cave. Ilara held her position, her rifle steady, until they disappeared back down the ravine, their footsteps fading into the silence. Only then did she allow herself to release the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her body slumped against the rock, trembling uncontrollably. They were gone, for now. But his words, "This ain't over," hung in the air, a chilling promise of future threat. She had bought them time, but the fight for Lily's safety was far from finished. The immediate danger had passed, but the chilling words of the pursuer echoed in Ilara's mind, "This ain't over." The boss always gets what he wants. They had retreated, but they would be back. Or they would send others. Ilara knew this small cave was only a temporary respite, not a true sanctuary. As the first, pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees, painting the snow in hues of grey and lavender, Ilara made her decision. They had to keep moving. They needed to reach civilization, to find help, to find a place where Lily could truly be safe from this mysterious boss and his ruthless men. She shared the last of their meager food with Lily, a few bites of dried meat from her own dwindling emergency rations and a handful of cold, rehydrated beans. The child ate silently, her eyes still wide and haunted by the night's events, but she clung to Ilara's hand, her touch a small point of warmth and connection in the vast, cold wilderness. Ilara tended to Zephyr, giving him the last of his grain, whispering her gratitude for his steadfastness. The horse, though tired, seemed to understand the continued urgency, nuzzling her hand gently. Before leaving the cave, Ilara took a moment to try and obscure their tracks as best she could, using a pine bough to sweep the snow around the entrance, though she knew it was a largely futile gesture against skilled trackers and a determined hound. Their best defense now was speed and distance. The journey that day was a grueling ordeal. Ilara pushed Zephyr relentlessly, her own exhaustion a dull ache that she refused to succumb to. She chose a path that led generally eastward, hoping to strike a known trail or a river that might lead them towards a settlement, however small. The terrain was unforgiving, a succession of steep ridges, dense forests, and frozen creeks. Lily, bundled securely in front of Ilara, slept fitfully, her small body a constant, precious weight. Ilara's mind was a whirl of anxieties. Who was this boss? Why was he so determined to find Lily? Was it a family dispute, a vendetta, or something far more sinister? The journal had offered no names, only fear and a sense of being hunted. The lack of information was maddening, leaving Ilara to fight an enemy whose motives and resources were unknown. By late afternoon, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, mournful shadows, Ilara spotted something through the trees that made her heart leap with a surge of desperate hope. Smoke. A thin, wavering column of wood smoke rising into the still, cold air. It was faint, distant, but undeniably there. Smoke meant people. It meant shelter. It could mean safety. With renewed determination, she urged Zephyr towards it, her weariness momentarily forgotten. As they drew closer, she could make out the dark shapes of several buildings huddled in a small, snow-covered valley, a tiny, isolated settlement. It wasn't much, perhaps a logging camp or a remote trading post, but to Ilara, it looked like a paradise. Caution warred with her desperation. She didn't know who these people were, whether they would be friendly or hostile. After her encounter with the pursuers, her trust in strangers was at an all-time low. But Lily needed warmth, food, and a safe place to rest. And Ilara herself was at the end of her endurance. She decided to approach cautiously. As they neared the edge of the small clearing where the building stood, a dog barked, a sharp, territorial sound, different from the baying of the hound. A moment later, a figure emerged from the largest cabin, a stout, bearded man in a heavy woolen coat, a rifle cradled in his arms. He squinted at them, his expression wary. Ilara reined Zephyr in, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. "Hello the cabin," she called out, her voice hoarse. "We're in need of help." "A child, she's ill, and we've been traveling for days." The man didn't lower his rifle, but his stance softened slightly as he took in the sight of Ilara, clearly exhausted, and the small, bundled child in her arms. Another figure appeared in the doorway, a woman with a kind, weathered face, her expression one of concern. "Good heavens, John," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "Look at them. They're frozen half to death. Bring them in." The man, John, hesitated for another moment, then slowly lowered his rifle. "All right, Martha. Bring em in." Relief, so potent it almost buckled Ilara's knees, washed over her. She dismounted, carefully lifting Lily down. The child stirred, looking around with wide, fearful eyes. Ilara led Zephyr towards the cabin, her steps unsteady. The warmth that enveloped them as they stepped inside was a blessed shock, a wave of comfort that made her realize just how cold she had been. The cabin was simple but clean, a large stone fireplace radiating heat, the air filled with the scent of wood smoke and stew. Martha, the woman, immediately bustled forward, her eyes full of compassion as she looked at Lily. "Oh, you poor little thing," she murmured, gently taking Lily from Ilara's arms. "Let's get you warm and fed." Ilara felt a lump rise in her throat. After so many days of fear and struggle, this simple act of kindness was almost overwhelming. John, his initial suspicion replaced by a gruff concern, helped Ilara unsaddle Zephyr and led him to a small, sturdy barn, promising him food and shelter. Inside the cabin, Martha settled Lily near the fire, wrapping her in a warm blanket and offering her a small cup of broth. The child, though still wary, accepted it, her small hands trembling. Ilara sank onto a nearby bench, her body finally succumbing to the bone-deep exhaustion. She watched Martha fuss over Lily, her movements gentle and practiced. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ilara allowed herself to hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, they had found a refuge. Over a bowl of hot, nourishing stew, Ilara recounted a carefully edited version of their ordeal, focusing on being lost in the storm and Lily's illness, omitting the details about Thomas, the journal, and the pursuers. She wasn't sure yet how much she could trust these strangers, despite their kindness. John and Martha listened patiently, their expressions sympathetic. They were, it turned out, the proprietors of this small, remote trading post, serving the few trappers and prospectors who ventured into this wild region. They had seen their share of hardship and were not unaccustomed to helping travelers in distress. As night fell, Martha made up a small bed for Lily near the hearth, and the child, exhausted but finally warm and fed, drifted off to sleep, her small wooden bird clutched in her hand. Ilara found herself watching the child, a fierce protectiveness welling up inside her. Lily was safe, for now. But the threat still loomed. The words "the boss always gets what he wants" were a chilling refrain in her mind. She knew this small outpost, however welcoming, could not offer permanent protection if the pursuers were determined enough. Sooner or later, she would have to decide what to do, where to go to ensure Lily's long-term safety. But for tonight, under the watchful eyes of these kind strangers, in the warmth of their cabin, Ilara allowed herself a moment of rest, a brief respite from the relentless fear that had driven her for so long. She had faced the wilderness, battled the storm, confronted danger, and she had brought Lily through it all. A quiet strength settled within her, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. She had found a purpose in protecting this child, a purpose that had given her own life new meaning. As she lay down on the simple cot Martha had prepared for her, Ilara listened to the soft crackle of the fire and the gentle breathing of the sleeping child. A new dawn was coming, and with it, new challenges, new decisions. But tonight, there was peace. And in that peace, there was hope. The image of Thomas's desperate face, his last whispered word, "Lily," came to her. She had kept her unspoken promise to him. She had protected his Lily. And she would continue to do so, no matter what the future held. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Ilara felt she was no longer entirely alone in it.